news, everyone.
I'm back, baby.
It's Jake Ciely.
I'm great. Everybody else sucks.
Oh,
no. It's every nightmare I've ever had.
Excuse me?
It's time to check the link.
Pretty crazy, huh? But it doesn't matter because none of this has anything to do with the show.
You know what? You just made the list.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
It's all in football.
Sure, we talk about it all the time. Really? No.
What is up, you ducks? It is All in Football on FTN. You will notice that is not Jeff Ratcliffe. That is not Chris Meaney. That is not the wrestler from AEW, as many times as I've made that comment. I think, Daigle, real quick, from NBC Sports Edge, I'm going to let you give you a second to promote everything after you answer this question. How many times besides myself has somebody said you look exactly like the guy from Dark Order?
Not only have people thought I look like John Silver, but also people still mix it up because I was at NBC Sports Edge for so long. They forget that I'm now with 4 for 4.
That's true.
And
I just messed it up.
It happens.
You haven't have the shirt on.
It happens all the time still. I am associated to one brand, and I'm still very good friends with everyone over there, so it's no big deal.
You're not allowed to work anywhere else.
But yes, John Silver and 4 for 4, that's what's going on right now in my life.
Tell everybody about 4 for 4, where to check you out. Make sure you're following at not J Daigle, which there's a whole story about behind that, but he's told it a million times. Pretty tired.
And I'm sure I'll join you
story
in season again. We can tell the story then. It is clearly the off season, but as I was telling you behind the show, it doesn't feel like the off season for any of us as we continue churning out things. Not only that, but best ball season has now basically taken over 4 months out of the year. And that's really what's happening at 4 for 4 right now because John Paulson just released his first run of projections, and there are drop downs for Underdog, FFPC, drafters, even to sort for your best ball tournaments, as well as I'm behind the scenes churning out best ball tiers right now to be released next week, along with a top 200 and not a top 200 rankings so much as a top 200 list of how we should be drafting. I literally want you to download the CSV and start drafting via that way because we think it's the best strategy for Underdog in particular. And that's why I'm excited to be here with you, Ciely. One, because we haven't chopped it up all off season. I hear you have a girlfriend now. We probably need to talk about that. And two, as we are going and talking about today's subject, like it's good practice for me as I'm trying to hone down my own ranking. So very excited to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking that time. Yes, Jeff had a conflict. Meaney has a billion things going on, as Chris Meaney always does. He'll be back next week. If you want to check out Meaney and Jeff and all the stuff at FTN, code ALLIN, get you 20% off. If you want stuff at The Athletic, theathletic.com/BetsTV, all capitals, as I'm slapping my hands, which makes Barkley think I'm calling her over, and she's crawling around my feet right now. You can go over there, check out a first free month. We have a magazine potentially coming out as well, too, so I told John before I came on the show, I have a vacation coming up for my first vacation in, I think, the history of my life. Like, real vacation. Like, for everybody that knows out there, John, I've been out of the country to Toronto. So I put out of the country in quotes because they're just our friendly neighbors up north.
This is your first international trip?
But it's not even international because it's a territory of the United States anyway.
I consider it international, like it creates communication problems. Like that's what I think like real travel really is considered.
Like if you need to have Google Translate on your phone just in case.
That or if you need to like learn, like when I went to Russia for 2 months, I picked up a few slogans. Now I ate fish sandwiches for 2 whole months because I couldn't say anything else. But like that kind of language, I think like helps us grow as individuals. And so that's what I consider. You couldn't figure
out how to say like, can I have something that's not fish sandwich?
That night I walked over for borscht all the time. Even though borscht, I don't know if you know, beef tips and beet stew and beet broth. 2 of my favorite things, beef and beets. So actually it worked out great.
Really?
Yeah.
I was learning some German two days ago when I stopped by my girlfriend's work, by the way. Learning some had us basically bad phrases in German, but everything in German sounds angry. So I don't know, there's like a good way. You can't sound like
stern individuals. Yeah.
They are. But we're going to have fun on the show today, as John alluded to. So what we're going to talk about is we've done the ones, we've done the twos. This is now the threes plus. So there's not just threes. We're talking running back threes and wide receiver threes because we don't care about quarterback threes and tight end threes unless you're playing best ball, which, hey, go check out.
Even
John
then,
and
don't
John's.
care.
But we're going to talk about these. I have my rankings. I actually updated them real quick, John, before we came on, because there was a little tweak that I noticed that they were initially right after the draft, and I had made 2 tweaks, and I forgot. So they've been updated a little bit, but there's only 2 players. We'll talk about them. But basically that, and then we're going to get to, at the end of it, actually, it might just tie in naturally. We'll see. But like strategies when you're drafting it. Like, you know what? Screw that, John. We're doing that off the top, because that makes more sense as I'm changing the show on the fly. When you get to your RB3s and wide receiver 3s, what is your draft strategy? Not for best ball, just for straight redraft, because there's a lot of arguments out there that says just go pure upside. But then obviously there's the argument, well, then you have no bench come week 2 potentially because they're all busts. And then you have the arguments where I always say is why I lean towards upside, because why am I going to draft some guy that I know is finishing around RB40? I don't need that. You can find those guys every single week on the waiver wire. So where do you lean? Because now we're pretty much in rounds 8, 9, 10 plus of drafts. Where are you thinking? What is your thought process once you're at this point?
So right now, how I draft around this range is affected by how I open drafts. And that is, I believe there are maybe 7 true bell cows as it stands. And so right now, and again, I'm in the middle of best ball, even though I am still paying attention to redraft leagues and rankings since they alter a fraction. But right now, I do believe it's best to open up, and the strategical drafting proves this. And let's just look at Best Ball Manias the past 2 years, and that the advance rates, there are 2 trends that stuck out. One was essentially robust RB, and not just like 1 in the first 4 rounds. I'm talking 2 in the first 3 rounds of your drafts. Basically locking up 2 bell cows, and then from that point forward, sitting on it and either trying to prioritize tight end, drafting strong wide receivers, and then closing out by the 9th round, making sure you get 2 quarterbacks between rounds 6 through 9. 6 through 9, because that's when the tail end, not just because it's a few nice rounds, but because it's the tail end of the low end QB1s. And as we know, QB 1 through 12 has been the most predictable it's ever been in the last 5 years. And that's because like ADP is very significant, because we just looked at who's a running quarterback, and they usually just burst their way into the low end of the top 12 options. And so making sure you have both your quarterbacks, just 2, between round 6 through 9, and doing that and starting heavy running back, that then says I am waiting till later on for these RB3s, at least the RB3s on my roster. So your James White, Alexander Madison, Naheem Hines, James Cook, JD McKissick. I'm basically looking at who's falling that gets more targets, because I think that's a path for them having a higher ceiling than perceived, all because people are looking for 15 carries guys, and I'm trying to disperse through that.
Okay. So if you come down to the point where let's throw out 2 names. So you mentioned James White, and let's just say, forget where they drafted and the situation there. Just say James White is the 3rd down pass catching option. You know, James White RB 30 to 45 is going to be his range. Or you could say, you know what? Maybe I take another White. Maybe I take Rashad White, who, if something happens, potentially turns into a top 15. Would you take White versus White? Which way would you go? Like, is it going to come down to roster construction, or are you going to say, you know what, I'm going to take the guy who, 1 injury away, is all of a sudden a top 15 running back, because that's where the value lies every single time, versus a guy I know is more replaceable?
I am not as high on Rashad White short-term return as it seems like everyone else is. Leonard Fournette.
Then how about maybe a Gus Edwards? They're basically like a high-end backup. Okay, so there you go. Gus Edwards versus James White.
But also right now it's the discrepancy between J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards when we just did this last year before both got injured. Like the disparity between the two was already too far apart, given that if you go back 2 years ago, they closed the season and J.K. Dobbins merely outtouched Gus Edwards 62 to 59. They used both. This team very clearly, after they did not tender, or at least remove the tender from Tyson Williams, this team doesn't have any running back they had on their roster last year. That's why they have the most vacated carries from last year's production. So we assume all these carries will go to J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards in whatever order. I just want to make sure they're mashed up closer. Right now, that's not the case. Gus Edwards is still going significantly farther back. So that's why I think he's a tremendous arbitrage value. Like, for instance, Jeff Wilson last year, even though I know Jeff Wilson got injured, but Jeff Wilson last year, when Trey Sermon was the first running back being drafted in a committee backfield. That's what I always try to look for, especially in best ball, is to grab the value. But for you, I would take Gus Edwards over James White because I do think Gus Edwards actually has 15 to 20 carry potential in his bag of tricks. But James White, for me at least, still a very strong option that is going literally 17th, 18th round right now of underdog drafts. And just remember, it was only 2 games, very small sample. But James White did average 14 fantasy points per game in those 2 full games he played with Mac Jones. And then there is no one on this team that is going to take his role, right? Like Pierre Strong, even in being drafted in the 4th round, he recorded 9 drops on 71 career targets in college. Damien Harris, we knew he had double-digit touchdown upside last year, all because Cam Newton vacated a league-high carries inside the 5-yard line. That then trickled down to Damien Harris's opportunity. That was a good call. Ramondre Stevenson also at the end of last year never took over the backfield, but worked intermittently with Damien Harris. So all of these guys, even Pierre Strong, who did record 76 of his 627 carries for 15-plus yards, a very explosive back that none of the other 3 can do. Like all these guys have roles, but the most important role, in my opinion, the James White role, that's why James White still has it. And so I am still very high on James White.
Okay, so for wide receiver, similar strategy, different strategy. Is it going to completely depend on your roster makeup? Because, you could look at depending on where you're going early on and depending on how the draft falls, your first 3 wide receivers might have 2 in the range of like a Tyreek Hill who could, 1 week get you 20, 1 week get you 5. Let's say your first 2 wide receivers end up like that. Your third is a more stable player, or you have stable players at all 3 positions, or whatever it might be. Does your makeup determine where you're going for your wide receiver 4s and 5s on your fantasy team? Obviously, a lot of times your 4s and 5s are 3s and 4s on this list. So is that going to depend, or is it the player themselves where you'll say, you know what, here's another situation. I know Adam Thielen is going to be Adam Thielen, but what if Skye Moore takes off immediately and is the 1 and 2 with Juju Smith-Schuster? So I bring those 2 names up because they're pretty close in my rankings. So does it depend on your team, or does it depend on the player when you get down to these type of wide receivers where you say, my bench guy is going to be pure upside, or my bench guy needs to be somebody I could potentially use in case I have an injury?
And redraft, it won't matter so much for me, but in best ball, I'm definitely looking at stacking opportunities, so the roster does matter. At the same time, though, like we've already done this with a lot of these quarterbacks. I already see the hype, and I don't already mean to start burning my mentions here, but I've already seen the hype taking off for Terry McLaurin when we literally just did this with Michael Pittman last year. Michael Pittman was 16th in the entire league in targets and could only get to the wide receiver 28 in fantasy points per game overall, whereas Terry McLaurin had finished 1 spot above him, 15th in the league in targets from Taylor Heineke, and finished 36th in wide receiver fantasy points per game. Is Carson Wentz an upgrade from Heineke? Yes, but he's not an upgrade so much that we should now be bumping up Terry McLaurin's ADP to low-end wide receiver 2, in my opinion. Let Terry McLaurin come to you. Do not reach for Terry McLaurin. It doesn't make sense at all because, again, we just did this. I don't know why you want to do this again and overdraft him knowing what his situation is. And so I do take stands on situations like that. Adam Thielen could arguably outscore DK Metcalf and Terry McLaurin. Even with his yards per route run dipping in 5 consecutive years now, the fact he continues to lead the team in end zone targets matters. There will be a time when Justin Jefferson takes that role and opportunity over. But just the fact that we know Thielen has touchdown upside and the others in their situations genuinely might not. I like Thielen over those 2, honestly.
Okay. Then let me get you one more question, and then we'll go through these players. Back to running backs real quick. Or actually, you know what? This goes both. This running backs versus wide receivers. So let's say we're in rounds 11, 12, the teens. The double digits teens. We'll call 11 teens. I always call it teens anyway.
We should let everyone. It gets ugly after wide receiver 40 essentially, because then it's like committee wide receivers almost. Hey, this is a guy with 5 other players around him.
Let me ask you the same question I asked Meanie. The Jaguars and the Patriots. Do either team have a wide receiver that eclipses 1,000 yards?
No. Jaguars significantly better opportunity since Trevor Lawrence was 2 different players. He was Jekyll before. Which one's the smarter one? Which was the good person?
Jekyll's the hot. Wait,
the buttoned up one. Jekyll's the buttoned up one, correct?
No, is it the other way around?
It might be the other way around.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So Mr. Hyde's the crazy one.
Okay.
Dr. Jekyll's the
Trevor
smart one.
Lawrence was a doctor in his first 6 starts before their bye. When he averaged 6.5 yards per attempt, still not good, but at least he was developing. Whereas after the bye, he dipped nearly a full yard per attempt. Like he was terrible, unusable in fantasy, and not running at all after the bye. It's a totally different scheme. It's totally different coaching staff and individuals and
Peterson
plays
magic.
developing them. Yeah, but at the same time, the talent is at least around him, like a Christian Kirk, like a Marvin Jones, who I still think maybe not so much an explosive fantasy option, but a very good on-field product, like a veteran many teams would love to have in their locker room. And so I still think Trevor Lawrence, like in the Jaguars, would be the one. Whereas my favorite Patriots receiver is actually Kendrick Bourne, and he's not topping 1,000 yards. So no, I don't think any of them do.
No Devonte Parker that he gets back to his top 10 finish.
I've always thought, like, we know the career arc of Devonte Parker, how he only shows up in preseason and then disappears forever despite having immense talent. But like, remember, Devonte Parker got that contract extension only because he played 8 games in the second half of a season with Ryan Fitzpatrick whenever Preston Williams got injured. That might not seem like a big antecedent, Preston Williams being available, but Preston Williams that year actually led Devonte Parker in targets until he went down. And only then did Parker thrive. Like, it took so many situations for Parker to be an elite player. And so I just think the contract was kind of farce. Even though I am very happy he got his money, it just, whether he deserved it or not is very questionable.
Of course. All right. So then this was going to lead to where I was originally going to ask you a question. So now let's say rounds 11 again, we'll say 6 bench spots seems to be pretty much the norm. Do you go in, because I know a lot of people, so I'm assuming you agree with me on this part, is to tell other people, don't go in with a preset, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to draft this, I have to take this person by this point, or this player by this point, have to get this position locked up, I have to have my bench constructed as such. So we're not saying you have to do this. But in an ideal John Daigle bench world, how does your bench look? 4 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 5 and 1 because running backs are just so hard to cut, 3 and 3. Like, do you have an ideal of like, I feel best when I can have this?
I like 5 running backs and 9 wide receivers, or 6 running backs and 8 wide receivers. I don't need to go excessive and do completely anti-fragile with like 3 running backs and 11 wide receivers. That's always been to me, but nonsense. For a tournament like Underdog, for instance, when it's 416,000 entries and you have 150 entries, if you want to burn one because it's going to take literally being perfect over the course of 17 weeks, every single week, fine, whatever. Do your 11 wide receiver thing, put it on Twitter. You'll get likes and retweets. I don't give a damn. That's fine. But genuinely, it's a terrible, awful strategy to do. So I don't want any of that part. I instead try to like make sure I'm stacking my running backs and wide receivers accordingly. And we don't talk about quarterbacks and tight ends, but nonetheless, like this year even, I've been making sure I've been getting in early on Kyler Murray and Cardinal stacks, not only because I think you can still get DeAndre Hopkins with Kyler Murray at a reasonable rate. Zach Ertz is being underrated. Like, Zach Ertz averaged 8 targets per game without Hopkins last year. We get 6 games of that volume, presumably. And so adding him late also is great. And not only that, but if you started early, even in adding Zach Ertz late, you can start with Kyle Pitts. You can add your Cordarrelle Pattersons, who's severely undervalued, assuming he's used as a pass catcher as he was before he returned from injury, and they only treated him as a between-the-tackles grinder. But, like, remember, in Week 17, when all these best ball championships go off, the Cardinals play the Falcons. And so that's kind of how I've been prioritizing everything early.
Okay. All right, so now let's actually get to said rankings. And we'll start. I'm going to give you all the 3s that I have, and then we'll kind of run through. So for everybody out there, going to rapidish fire them, because we're going to kind of break down a lot of them. But Damien Harris is 25, ETN, Damien Pierce, AJ Dillon, Chase Edmonds, Devin Singletary, Miles Sanders, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Melvin Gordon, Tyler Algiere, Kareem Hunt, and Michael Carter. Starting at the bottom, because this was one of the most painful fantasy situations we had in the NFL draft. The excitement for Michael Carter through the roof, top 15 running back everywhere. They draft Breece Hall, and it was just crying across the world for Michael Carter. Is that too low for Michael Carter, or are you on my side of it where you think it's going to be 70-30 type of split? Carter has a great passing game role, but the player I keep comparing him to, John, is last year's Chase Edmonds. And the fact that, yeah, he'll finish his RB32, but it's going to be a roller coaster ride to get there, and he's just stuck in a role now. Like, they don't trade up. Granted, it was only 2 spots, but that kind of tells you more. I actually think trading up 2 spots versus trading up 10 spots to get Breece Hall is more telling, because they were so scared he wasn't going to make it 2 more picks. And that just tells me Breece Hall is the guy.
There are many ways to look at this. You compared Carter to Chase Edmonds when I would say I would think Breece Hall's the one who's Chase Edmonds, since he did average 27 catches per year in college. And if that's the case, perhaps Michael Carter is James Conner, where they put him in for a singular role that allows him to outscore on fewer touches Breece Hall. At the same time, though, think about how often we've done this in recent years, with Nick Chubb getting drafted to a Carlos Hyde backfield and everyone was off Chubb for the most part. Think about just last year, Marlon Mack and Jonathan Taylor. And, Jonathan Taylor was a 3rd, 4th round pick and suddenly was the RB1 overall, perhaps even number 1 player overall, depending how you look at it this year. And so I just keep thinking back to how often we actually do this and waste our time doing this. And so for redraft leagues, I understand you only get one choice really in your home league. That's the one you're talking the most shit in. And so that's the one you want to get right. But again, for committees, I just go back to value. And so right now, the value, it leads me to believing like I don't know everything, and thus I am taking the dip on Michael Carter. And like right now, I can't get Breece Hall at all because he's being treated as like a top 15 option, and that's crazy to me, assuming like we don't know everything. And so I do agree with you. Like I would rather be higher on Michael Carter and lower at Breece Hall at this moment, even though I do think Breece Hall is the better talent. But again, I'm trying to take my own analysis out of the frame.
Okay, so let's go back to the top. Damien Harris. Now, I don't know. I've only done a few drafts so far, so you probably have a little bit more like insight to where these are skewing, especially for best ball. But it feels to me that Damien Harris and Ramondre Stevenson are coming very close to each other. For reference, for everybody out there, because I didn't go all the way down to 41, that's where I have Stevenson. I am gobbling up, like you said, like going all in on Damien Harris, because I think people are forgetting. And we talked about this on an athletic show, and Brandon Funston said this. They're kind of like romanticizing what Stevenson did last year and the fact that he had 2 great games, but it took 20-plus carries in both, as I keep saying. Damien Harris was getting 100 yards on 17 carries, 15 carries. Damien Harris was the better running back between the two. Now, do I think Damien Harris is getting 70% of the workload? Absolutely not, John. But as you can see, I have Harris at 25, Stevenson down at 41. I think if anything happened to Harris, Stevenson has value, but I think this is very much Harris White, as you mentioned, with Stevenson the third, as in if something happens, sure, Stevenson, but I think this is Harris White. I think Harris is being undervalued right now.
There were also, remember, 2 games that Harris started but left injured, and those are ones that Stevenson, if you're just looking at the box score, led the backfield in touches. It's very skewed how often Stevenson was used when that wasn't the case at all. They truly were a backfield by committee, and then Stevenson would always come off the field inside the 10-yard line, unless they're like no huddling and he's still there. That's why Harris led the team and led Stevenson with 14 carries inside the 5-yard line compared to 5 for Ramondre. And so overall, like Damien Harris, he's the one, not Stevenson, assuming both are healthy, has double-digit touchdown upside, which is also why he had 15 touchdowns last year. But again, with James White healthy, I think it's an even lesser role than before. And so assuming James White's healthy, like, again, that's the guy I actually want to be on, because I still think there's a chance this offense changes at least a hair. The fact Mac Jones, you take away that abysmal 3-attempt win game on prime time, like Mac Jones averaged 32 pass attempts per game around that. And so I think they want to open the offense more like that this year, knowing they tried to add like another downfield stretcher, knowing they tried to add Strong, who again ran a 4.37 40 at his massive size. Like I think they're trying to get explosiveness in that lineup to open it up for Mac Jones. And so sure, a little, I don't mind being higher than consensus on Damien Harris, but I also want to be very careful because he is basically a touchdown or bust option in my opinion. Okay.
So then real quick, names behind him that you would draft on my list that you would draft over Damien Harris. Are there ones? I'm sure that by the sound of it, I'm assuming you probably have a player or 2 that you would take before you took Damien Harris.
Well, Damien Harris is actually 26 on my list.
Okay.
So now
one guy.
now here's the thing. I'm still tinkering with this though. That's the thing. And for instance, like I probably made a mistake in putting like AJ Dillon, Miles Sanders, Cordero Patterson, CEH behind him. Like this is like a group, a tier I'm trying to tinker with right now. And so I'll still probably have to adjust a little bit. But right now, that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, so as the cliche has become now in past years, the RB dead zone. That's basically where we are. We're talking the RB dead zone right now. We're talking that we're going to get a lot more misses than hits. Not that they're all going to not have value, but being taken in the 5th round, even the 6th round, like a lot of these guys are so like, put it this way. That list that I just gave you down to Michael Carter, let's throw in Patterson, Penny, Pollard, Isaiah Spiller, especially if anything happened to Austin Eckler, Stevenson, just mentioned, Ronald Jones, James Robinson, who knows, Mostert, Madison. I'm going down the... You could just argue this is one enormous tier of running backs, and this is why people say avoid the RB dead zone in round 5, because just wait 2 more rounds, take some more wide receivers or a tight end, and then draft the one of these guys that are still there on the board, multiples of these guys.
Even J.D. McKissick, like you could add him too in
yes.
there. Since
I was going to keep going.
you can keep going on. You already mentioned Mostert, but I think Mostert's very underrated right now as well. Whether he stays healthy or not, that's a whole nother topic. But if he were to stay healthy, he's very underrated. So yeah, I agree. This is the dead zone practically, but also as I told you earlier, the way I will try to be drafting and making sure I get at least 1, but ideally 2 strong running backs at the top of the board. Because I also think the overall wide receiver 1, like there's a major argument to be had. Like I think Stephon Diggs should be equal with Cooper Kupp. And that's why for me, it's more about exposure in a portfolio this year than it is like hammering down Cooper Kupp or Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase. Because I think there's so many potential number 1 overall options.
Okay. Now, if everybody was watching, I was leaning down, petting Borkley. She's like under my desk and kind of...
We need attention right now.
I know, she does. So I'm going to get to Chase Edmonds in a second. I'm glad you brought him up because I wanted to go to number 2 right behind Harris, and that's Travis Etienne. So you said what I love you said. It was we're doing the best of our knowledge right here. I think the answer on Etienne is that we don't know, period. We're not just talking about somebody who didn't get to play his rookie season. We're not just talking about somebody who has some competition depending on how James Robinson looks. But likes was the word I was going for here is this is a new coaching staff. This is a new team. They did not draft James Robinson. Well, nobody drafted James Robinson. They didn't even sign James Robinson. They didn't draft Travis Etienne. They haven't done anything. We don't know who they like, and we don't know what kind of timeshare. Oh, by the way, Doug Peterson, which was the narrative for years on end, that he doesn't use a bell cow until he did. I'm glad everybody knows that. But where are you in ETN? Is this basically, let me phrase it this way, John. Is 26 wrong no matter what way we cut it? Like it's too high or too low, and it's just not going to be right?
That's probably the correct assessment, but I do want to be higher than consensus on ETN, believing in his talent still. Also, there's this, like, I keep coming back to the fact that, for instance, Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, both serious injuries, returning from knee injuries, and ETN and James Robinson, ETN clearly more recovery time since he did in the preseason, but both returning from knee injuries. My concern with these backfields is that we know Dobbins and ETN are the supremely better athletes, right? Like those are the guys who are more likely to recover to their full health than Gus Edwards and James Robinson, who are just good at the game. Like they're amazing running backs purely, but they're not like explosive guys that jump off the page. And so I wonder if that makes their recovery slower. And if that's the case, then ETN and Dobbins should get a little advantage here in our rankings. And that's what I keep coming back to. But for the Jaguars backfield, I do want to bet on talent at the end of the day. And that still goes back to ETN.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And especially the interesting thing was the Ravens completely till after the draft, but the Jaguars almost similar. Didn't take Snoop Connor until real late. So to your point, would kind of assume that these teams have confidence in their health if they're not addressing the running back situation. I mean, although the Jaguars brought back Raquel Armstead. Hey, can we just keep this guy in the NFL? Like, I feel so bad for Armstead at this point because of everything that's happened to him. Like, just the fact that he has an NFL contract, I'm just happy.
Snoop Connor's going to go the Benjamin route where someone's going to keep him stuffed in their dynasty roster for no good reason at all.
7 years?
Yeah, for no good reason at all. Just like 7th round running backs, just remember, like, we don't care. Just move on. It doesn't matter at all.
So, Damien Pierce, I keep calling discount Kenneth Walker. And you want to talk about somebody that potentially bell cow rolled. Now, I don't think he's going to be used that much in the passing game, but that depth chart, I was going to breeze past him unless you had any takes on the fact that he's just volume on a bad team. I was just going to move on right past Pierce unless any.
I think my only question mark is, can he handle volume, since he never did at Florida, since he was strictly part of a committee. In his entire career, just 374 offensive touches and never reached 600 yards rushing in any season. And so was that because of a committee, or was he not capable of doing this? And that's the one reason why I keep not worrying about his ADP unless he dips. And right now he's not dipping. Think about it. The Texans running back is not one we should be trying to steal from others. Like, he's still the Texans running back. And so I'm taking the less aggressive approach to Damien Pierce.
Okay, sure. A.J. Dillon, I could see easily finishing higher, but, we're talking about a timeshare backfield.
Yeah, I agree. Could definitely finish higher. He's the one who's going to be the death of me at the end of the day, because it's still just like a singular role that's touchdown dependent, because there's no way he's usurping Aaron Jones. There's no way.
But that's the thing, is like, I feel like it could shift into where he's the 15 touch per game guy and Aaron Jones becomes the majority pass catcher. And all of a sudden that, if you just said it, touchdowns, Aaron Jones, look at his rushing yards the past 2 years. 1,000. Like, his value is then the touchdowns. And all of a sudden you're talking A.J. Dillon getting a dozen touchdowns. Like, he finishes higher. But Chase Edmonds was the one I wanted to talk about, because you brought on Raheem Mostert. Holy crap. We're headed towards the combination of, like, the Patriots plus the 49ers together, because everybody's talking about McDaniel and everything. Oh, where does he come from? Shanahan tree. And what do they do with running backs? But the truth is that Myles Gaskin might not even be the roster opening day if you're watching these moves, because they also brought in Sony Michel. Chase Edmonds was the first, though. So what are we doing here? Because Mostert's been with McDaniel. Edmonds, I think I was not on Edmonds last year, and partly of kind of what I alluded to before, but it would assume by their actions he's the guy. But this could just be an entire mess where I think at the end of the year, John, it's like, yeah, one of them finishes his RB20, but it's not going to be any kind of consistent, reliable value in fantasy. Unless you have a take on Mostert.
It's not really a strong one. I just think that even when Mostert was signed, remember at his presser, he noted that McDaniel even told him he's going to return to the role that he was last year, ideally, assuming he's healthy. And they're targeting week 1, but I don't think it's a soft target like Chris Godwin, where, like, I don't expect him to be ready by week 1. I think it's more of we are taking this guy slow, knowing his injury history, and then we will unleash him. Also, just the fact that Chase Edmonds has never been used as a workhorse. Like, that was our opportunity last year, and we pretty much had to bank on 4.5 targets per game instead, and not the carries, since he averaged fewer than 10 carries per game. And so I
He's barely ever hit double-digit carries for his career. It
took David Johnson getting out of the way for him, like the only times he was ever used as a workhorse, and same thing for James Conner out of the way at the end of the year last season. At the same time, though, when they signed him, they did note his usage in a zone stretch scheme, like knowing he would be better fit, presumably, in that style of offense. And so I do think he's getting slightly overblown, thinking this is still a committee, and Mostert's the one who's being undervalued now. That's why I keep grabbing Mostert instead as my RB4 or RB5 in the later ranges, because everyone just always plays the injury card, saying, yeah, like he was injured the last 2 years. Of course, he's going to get injured this year. Not sure that's true at all. But yeah, just the fact that Chase Edmonds, no coach has ever used him as a workhorse. So that has to mean something. And so that's why I kind of want to shy away from believing that and being bullish on him. I believe in the talent. I'm okay if his ADP falls to a respectable place, but right now people are treating him as if he's a 3-down player, and he's never been that.
Yes, I completely agree with you there. All right, so last one I'm going to ask you about, and then I'm going to ask what you want to input as your running back. But last one, RB34, Tyler Algiere. I'm sniffing or drinking or whatever the Kool-Aid might be, but it's really comes down to it's him and Cordero Patterson, and it's the Mike Davis excuse from last year, but while that might sound like a bad thing, John, because of what Mike Davis did to us, he's RB34. He's not RB22, 24 like Mike Davis was last year. And that's why I'm on an Algiere, because yes, it's the Falcons. Yes, it's Marcus Mariota. Yes. But again, somebody who could potentially carry the ball 15 times per game at RB34, and I think he's going even further behind that, is why I'm in on Algiere. Where are you? Are you with me on this, or are you going to call me, stop trying to do the Mike Davis thing again?
No, it's not the Mike Davis thing, because they're just two totally different profiles. Like, Algiere is closer to T.J. Duckett than he is to Mike Davis, so we can't compare. That's a boomer reference, actually. Somebody might not even know who T.J. Duckett is, but that was
a big pullback right there. That's what.
But it's probably just the Falcons comp that got popped into my head. But no, he's not like that. I just where I'm focused at is the fact that Cordero Patterson, prior to injury in Week 11, 5.5 targets per game, and then post that just only the full. Oh, no, my math's wrong. 2.9 targets per game post-injury. Whereas that's when, remember, with 11 carries per game in that stretch over his last 7 starts, they were using him as a true running back. And that's what, even with Chicago, he has proved he can't do. He can do a lot of things, but he can't be a 16-carry guy because that's not his skill set. And so you have to ask, was it due to injury or was it due to them finding a new role for him? I would like to think it was just due to injury, and they still thought putting him out there to move the ball between the tackles was a good idea, even though it was not. And so I would rather be much higher on Cordero Patterson, much higher, especially at a discount right now, than Tyler Algiere. That's just me.
Okay. So anybody, before we move to wide receivers, anybody that's not in my 36, so in the 25 to 36, is there anybody outside that? I think Cordell Patterson's at 37. We've talked about him a lot. But anybody else that you would say, you know what? He deserves to be in this conversation. You have him too low.
Did you say the Seahawks running backs?
Both of them? Carson's
no, we don't count.
gone.
Like, I don't even think Carson plays this year at all.
No, that's why I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Kenneth Walker's in the 20s for me. He's right around 22, I think. So that's where Walker is. Rashad Penny's 38.
So I think you should bring those two closer together because we just don't know, especially after how they used Penny over the last month of the season. Do I think Kenneth Walker starts?
You're talking. If I could make Penny a top 10 running back like he was for the next, you're
can't
talking
make
to my
Penny a
heart
top
here.
10,
you're talking to my heart here. I love some Penny, but so go ahead.
I don't think you can make Penny a top 10, but can you bring those two closer together? Because we don't know. Yes. And that's kind of where I lean right now. So just like Michael Carter, right now I'm getting Rashad Penny at a discount in my mind, and I can't get much of Kenneth Walker since that's where everyone gravitates to. And just remember, you know this, you've been doing this long enough. The rookie fever post-draft is insane. That's like the time you don't draft rookies because that's all anyone is honed in on. So Skye Moore, all these guys, I can't get any of right now, but fortunately we live in the age of distraction where civilization's attention span is at its lowest point ever. And so, like, give it a month and I'll be able to get these guys. No worries.
Well, that's what I was about to say. You just brought up a really good point. Back to the strategy thing is right after the draft, don't draft rookies. Let everybody else overdraft. Now wait for training camps to start and be like, oh, the rookie's he's getting third team touches and blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, okay, now you swoop back in once they all drop down. There you go. That's how you work
why
it.
There are some people right now that are talking about their exposures and like making sure they have the correct allotment of players. But right now, if you're doing best ball leagues, you should strictly just be drafting. And because remember, we have 2 months to hedge our exposures. Do not worry about exposures at all. Even if you're 90% a player right now, and I think I have like 90% like Jalen Hurts, honestly. Just remember, like we can hedge that in August. Like it's no big deal at all. So just keep drafting the best players at what we believe are discounts right now.
Hey, but John, don't you know Jalen Hurts can't throw the ball? Didn't you know that? Come on, didn't you know?
You know, also he's been a QB1 in 16 of 19 his career starts.
You're talking like I cannot bang the table enough for Jalen Hurts.
By the way, like I'm the guy. It's funny because I still try to navigate all of these waters since I do betting, best ball, DFS, I do everything, and like I also think despite banging for Jalen Hurts as a top 6 quarterback, I also think Jalen Hurts is not on the Eagles next year. Because like those two things to me those two things don't correlate at all. Like the Eagles with everything they've done this offseason, they have basically set up the Broncos personnel, and then they have like Drew Lock who can run under center. Remember, it's not good enough in the NFL to have a league average quarterback, which is what Jalen Hurts is, and it's better than we thought he was. You still, if you have the capital, which they do next year, yet again, because they put themselves in position to have it, you still have to make sure when everything crumbles around you, your quarterback can bail you out, and Jalen Hurts can't bail his team out. Like that's the. But if he develops, he can. I think it's going to take a lot of development, though.
So the one thing I said too is not just top 6. I said if you told me there was a quarterback outside the top 5 who could unseat Josh Allen, it's Jalen Hurts, because you get that rush. It's Lamar Jackson's MVP season. Like you get that rushing, not quite 1,100, but 800 to 900 with the rushing touchdowns. We're talking fantasy purely, and all he does is throw for 3,200 yards and 20 23, 24 boom, he's right there neck and neck with Josh Allen. And that's all it takes when you run that much. And we're talking fantasy. And as John said, they're not mutually exclusive, that he can have one of the best statistical fantasy seasons, and the Eagles might still be like, you're not our answer next year.
And I think like Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray are right there that can take down Josh Allen this year. Like Lamar Jackson's in such an awesome spot.
He's done it.
He's again going overlooked. But remember, like they changed their offense entirely. Never again will he throw 32 pass attempts per game. Never. And that was 5 more than he had at any season since he's been in the NFL, was last year. But at the same time, if we reduce that, that also means it's closer to his 2019 MVP season. That's terrific for us. It may not be terrific for the ancillary options, but there are only 2 places to go anyways, arguably 1 in Mark Andrews, depending on how you feel about Rashad Bateman.
2. Oh, thank you so much for the wonderful transition to wide receivers. Because number 2, let's talk Rashad Bateman at number 28. Am I nuts? Or is that possibly too low, John?
I have him at 35, so I don't think you're...
Oh, so you're the other side.
Yeah, I'm just not a believer in the talent. Like, I think he's a more of an...
Oh, okay.
I think he's a more of an intermediate option. He cannot do what Marquise Brown does. Like, if they unleash him like that...
I don't want him to be doing what Marquise Brown does. Let me make this argument for you.
That's a good argument, too.
Or make argument to you, not for you. So, like, you brought up Lamar Jackson throwing fewer attempts per game and all that type of stuff. I think if you watch some of the success and failures, and granted Marquise Brown is a great downfield threat, and Lamar Jackson's a good downfield thrower. Like, I remember coming out of college, like, oh, it's that downfield, blah, blah. We've seen it. That arm is amazing. But I think if you're talking about how you see and what you watch the success on a real NFL level for the Ravens and Lamar Jackson, it's Mark Andrews, and I believe it's a talent like Bateman. Do I think Bateman is one of the most gifted wide receivers in the NFL? Absolutely not. But I think for the success of Lamar Jackson, I think Bateman being, as you said, an amazing intermediate player, not so great downfield, that he could do some stuff after the catch that keeps him inside the top 30. And I could even see the top 24 as being a wide receiver too, because I think this fits what we've realized about Lamar Jackson's success in the NFL. And I don't want Lamar Jackson throwing 7 attempts 30 yards downfield.
Correct. And that would then make the case, which I think is what you're doing, for a higher floor option, right? Like a dependable wide receiver as opposed to the splash guy Marquise Brown was. Even though with Lamar Jackson, Marquise Brown's splits were incredible. He was the wide receiver 12 in fantasy points per game from Lamar Jackson, whereas like his splits with Tyler Huntley decreased significantly. Because it was Mark Andrews who had the rapport with Tyler Huntley, especially 10+ yards downfield. So like those splits are crazy. But yeah.
And see, I think you get 130, 140 targets like Marquise Brown had, and instead of getting 60% catch rate, you get more of a 70% on 120, and you basically have Marquise Brown numbers with a better floor, which I want anyway. I don't want Marquise Brown showing up for 20 points one week and 3 the next, unless I'm playing best ball.
There's a greater chance in my mind that Bateman averages 6 to 8 catches per game than Marquise Brown ever had a chance to, but I also, again, don't think he's an explosive player whatsoever. So if it comes down to volume and targets, which fantasy ultimately does, despite all these cool stats we always tweet, then yeah, I probably am too low on him.
Okay, so for all references, Marquise Brown is at 33. I actually had him lower before the DeAndre Hopkins suspension. That pulled him up a little bit, so that's as a sidebar right there. For all intents and purposes, everybody out there, DeAndre Hopkins is at 43. These are year-long rankings. Obviously, once Hopkins is back on the field, he's not going to be 43. Right. He would be top 20. So keep that in mind. That's one of those things, like, don't draft purely by rankings. If you're going by mine, depending on like some sites, like I would actually put Hopkins higher. But anyway, that's
and right now he's going in the 6th round. If you can probably wait a little longer and get him in the 7th or 8th. I've only been taking him when I take Kyler. I haven't been taking him as a standalone option. I don't know if that's right or wrong. That's just how I've been doing it.
Okay. So, rookie. Let's go back to it, and let's talk one. So, we're past the point of, like, so there's 2 in this range. We're not talking Drake London, because Drake London made my top 24. Barely. He's at the low end of that. But in a similar situation, volume, but in a different volume, because he's going to a team that is run, and then basically 2 options in the passing game. But one of them might be Treylon Burks, because guess what? They got rid of one of the alpha wide receivers in the NFL and drafted Treylon Burks to be the answer. And we don't know what Robert Woods is at this point. We don't even know if he's healthy for week 1, 100%. That's a serious injury that people are still speculating when he's going to start getting back on the field. Treylon Burks at 29. I also have this issue, John. I wasn't the biggest Treylon Burks fan. Like, I had 4 tier 1 wide receivers before the draft. Burks started tier 2 for me. So I'm admittedly already low on Burks. Is 29 too low for me coming from I'm not a giant Burks fan, or is that right in the fact that now I offset that by the opportunity of playing with Tannehill as his 1?
I think that's about fair. Just think of the talent, the superior player to a lot of receivers in the league that A.J. Brown is, and he's averaged 105 targets the past 2 years. Like, this offensive scheme does not focus on honing in on receivers as they do crossing routes and then getting the ball to said receivers so they can create explosiveness upfield. And so, like, they're not going to feed Treylon Burks the ball. It's going to come down to whether he can get open or not. And I think he can get open or not, but his profile as a bigger-bodied, fast guy is much more volatile than we would like to assume. And so, sure, like, I don't think it's guaranteed that the ceiling is there, but also with Robert Woods being traded for basically because he's PFF's #1 run blocking wide receiver, like, there isn't much target competition, right, for Treylon Burks. That's what it keeps coming back to for me. And so I still want to be a little bit higher than that, but I don't think it's egregious to be lower on him.
Okay. So before we get out of here, I do want to answer Beck's question. Any third QBs you like late in Superflex? Mentions Trubisky, Mariota, Locke. Am I nuts or I'm grabbing a ton of Locke right now? Like, I'm not. I'm not saying like I like his talent, but I mean, he's going to play with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I mean, sure. He had Cortland Sutton banged up. He had Judy missing time. Like, I'm not saying I'm not campaigning for Drew Lock, but he's a starting quarterback who takes a lot of deep shots.
Yeah, but those deep, like, he should do less deep shots because
he should.
his intermediate ball is actually better than his deep shots, but there's a reason he leads the league in deep shots because he's terrible at them and he doesn't realize it. That's the whole point. Like, this is one of my biggest stances this offseason so far has been Cortland Sutton for me should be ranked over Jerry Jeudy. And that's because, like, Cortland Sutton for his career has been dragged down by Drew Lock ever since their first game together. And they've played only 9 career full starts together, but Sutton was a wide receiver 2, and then from that point forward, hadn't finished inside the top 38 wide receivers in any game with Drew Lock. And it's because Drew Lock is bad. And bad in particular at throwing, where Cortland Sutton is, whereas Russell Wilson's the complete opposite. Like, Sutton should be treated like Metcalf of last year from Russell Wilson, and yet everyone's going to the shallow slot receiver and Jerry Jeudy, who I do think is incredibly talented, but there's an argument to be made that Sutton is just the better prospect overall and the better player overall. So I love Sutton still from Russell Wilson. And if anything for the Seahawks, I just think, like their running backs, Lockett and Metcalf should be jammed together closer, whereas I think like 21 spots separate them right now, and that seems egregious to me. And I know the rapport Russell Wilson and Lockett had in having a perfect passer rating to one another historically, but overall, Lockett still, remember, like, wins you weeks at times. He has 2 or 3 games. Yes, he'll disappear at times, but he has 2 or 3 games per year where he's literally the overall wide receiver 1 on the week. And so I keep factoring that in. And I see him in the 6th to 8th round. It's like, I'm still going to take a chance on that guy.
Yeah, I got Sutton and Jeudy about 3 spots apart. Almost neck and neck.
And to answer the question, because you can get them later, I am a little bit higher on the Patriots stacks and Mac Jones, James White, and Kendrick Bourne. It's not sexy at all, but it's a tough division where they have to throw the ball, and I do think they open up the offense in year 2 for Mac Jones. So that's kind of the way I've been leaning later on.
Okay, before we wrap this up and get you out of here, John, and thank you again for your time. Somebody outside my 36 who is too low that needs to be there. Do you have one, or would you not even put? The answer could be nobody, but Hopkins aside, because Hopkins is his own enigma situation with the suspension. So, kind of curious if there's anybody. I mean, you could even say somebody that doesn't deserve to. You'll take either question. Somebody in the 36 you would never draft there. Somebody outside the 36 you would pull up.
I am debating on Hunter Renfro.
I wanted to put him higher, but Devonte Adams.
Well, I don't have him as a wide receiver 3 either, and like I also have a fade on Devonte Adams, not a full on, but like in the range around wide receiver 10, and it's like both can't happen, right? Like one of them has to exceed with a heaping of targets, and it's probably Adams. But at the same time, if it is the case, then we should move Hunter Renfro even lower. Like, he shouldn't be a fringe wide receiver 3. He should be a wide receiver 5. And so, like, I keep coming back to, I need to adjust to the extreme. And, like, I'm too scared to adjust right now. So I don't know which way to go, and I'm trying to figure it out. Also, Devonta Smith, like, we should be extremely lower on. Like, it's so much lower. The fact he was the only person to throw to in that offense. And I love Dallas Goedert, but, like, the only wide receiver to throw to. And knowing Jalen Hurts is inaccurate deep, it was Smith who finished wide receiver 43 in fantasy points per game with a little over 100 targets. So now add in A.J. Brown, like Smith won't get the volume and his targets will be inaccurate. Like he's the inferior player now in his own offense. Like it's a disaster for Devonta Smith in year 2.
All right. That's a good one. It'll make me rethink my own ranking of Devonta Smith at 35. But if you have to think about it, make sure you're following John Daigle at not Jay Daigle. And one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, non-J. And one more time, at 444 Football, remind everybody what you got going on over there. Check you out.
John Paulson's projection just went live. That's very big for us because now we can start rolling out our strategies and tiers like I'm doing with Best Ball starting next week. So stay tuned to that. And then if you like audio, which if you're listening to this, I guess you do, then the most accurate podcast on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. We produce 2 episodes per week each offseason. So enjoy the redraft talk there.
Yeah, and thanks again to John. Make sure you're checking out everything at FTN. Code ALLIN, get you 20% off. theathletic.com/bets. all capitals. Get you, that's not part of the word, but that gets you your first free month. We'll be back next Wednesday. Meanie will be joining me. Maybe a little bit of hockey. It's just fun for him, but we'll see you later. Thanks again to John.